Was I muting it? Hello, welcome to the webinar. We would be going live in 5 minutes, so we're just waiting on the time to start. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on diffusing the complexity of automating risk tracking and real-time alerts. So we have just 3 minutes remaining. We're going to go live in 3 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on diffusing the complexity of automating risk tracking and real-time alerts. We are live and online and have registrants from US and Europe joining in on our webinar today. My name is Talal Awan. I'm the business director at Core Data and will be moderating this webinar. I've been part of the Core Data family for 3 years now, during which I've supported over a dozen pharma drug and device manufacturers in meeting their compliance analytics, monitoring, and sunshine reporting challenges within the EU and United States. It is my pleasure to bring to you today this webinar on diffusing the complexity of automating risk tracking and real-time alerts with my guest, Ned Mumtaz, who will be introducing himself shortly, and our expert on call, Mohammed Awais. Mohammed is a well-known expert in compliance analytics. He led a workshop on tools for data analytics at the Seton Hall Law School, and most recently spoke at the annual Compliance Monitoring Forum. He'll be joining us in the last 15 minutes of the webinar today, so please keep your questions handy. Now I would like Ned to introduce himself. Ned.
Thank you, Tola. Hello, everyone. My name is Ned Mumtaz. I'm the lead for compliance and practice lead at Core Data for pharmaceutical life sciences. I've been in the pharmaceutical life sciences industry for over 20 years. I worked in the industry for around 15 years for Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Schering-Plough, Eisai, and Otsuka, and I've been with Core Data for over 4 years. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. So we have put together an agenda for today's session. We've already gone through the introductions. Mohammed would be introducing them himself later in the webinar. We would be discussing risk management, a complex ecosystem. We'll be looking at the complexity in collecting and monitoring of compliance data. Then diffusing complexity with compliance tools. Here we will talk about monitoring analytics and automated alert mechanisms to help streamline the complexities surrounding collection, monitoring, and analyzing of compliance data. And then we will dive into key risk indicators and risk automation. We would take you through a heat map exercise to identify key risk indicators. Ned will introduce us to this process, followed by a short key risk indicator workshop by Mohammed Awais. A request before we proceed. I realize that the webinar format sometimes discourages us from actively asking questions because we can't see the speaker. I encourage you to type in your questions through the course of this webinar, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. In addition, a recording of this webinar will also be sent to all attendees. And moreover, we are offering a free KRI workshop to all attendees. All you have to do is drop in your contact details in the chat box before the end of this webinar. We would be happy to come at your offices, bring delicious food. We're very famous on bringing delicious food, and conduct this workshop absolutely free of cost. So with that, I hand it off to Ned to start the webinar. Ned.
Excellent. Thank you, Tala. So team, what we would do today is we will walk through, as Tala pointed out, first the complexity of risk management and its elements as an ecosystem. And then we'll talk about opportunities for diffusing risk, especially the balance between capacity and capability. And then we will talk about opportunity for automating some of the compliance management and oversight process and explore if that can add to the capacities for manufacturers and compliance teams in managing risk. And then lastly, I'll partner up with my colleague, Mohammed Awais, in sharing with you some of the steps in setting up a key risk indicator workshop and then enabling and automating those key risks. So to start with, I want to discuss with you what I have observed and what I have discussed in my interactions with several manufacturers, some of the biggest compliance monitoring obstacles. I feel that for thousands of manufacturers across North America and EU, the real challenge is about balancing risk management against monitoring and auditing capacity. Many capable compliance professionals, compliance officers, and others in the compliance field are very well aware and have the requisite expertise to mitigate risk to sufficiently manageable levels. The challenge that they continue to face is in balancing that risk management against the capacity they have in managing that risk. They're often forced to select very specific elements within the broader risk spectrum to manage those capacities. So, in order to enable that, what I have shared with you in this webinar, or plan to share with you in this webinar, is the notion that can automation help in identifying, addressing, and mitigating compliance risks, and specifically capacity shortage. Some have called it risk management 2.0 amongst the compliance professionals and compliance community. But that's a very simple concept of automating because risk is very complex, as many of you experience. It does not easily lend itself to automation. It does not easily get tamed by just information. There are some very specific methods that you may want to consider adopting if you want to really ensure that the risk is managed through automation, and we will explore some of those. I talk about this having had an opportunity to speak on this topic at over half a dozen conferences, have had an opportunities to discuss this across dozen or so webinars, and speak with over approximately 100 plus drug and device manufacturers compliance teams around their needs for automation and risk management. I believe the setup for such a program is easier and leaner than some believe. As Tala pointed out, we have over 2 dozen customers who have applied many of these techniques and methods that we will share with you. And then beyond that, in my conversations with over 100 drug and device manufacturers, many have already experienced some of the benefits of setting up risk management thresholds and triggers for automation to minimize the risk. I feel there are several low impact and cost effective steps that lean compliance teams can take to progress this program. Hence the title for today's session, Diffusing the Complexity of Automating Risk, Tracking and Real-Time Alerts. As part of this session, as my colleague Tala pointed out, we will also interview and converse with our colleague and CEO, Mohammed Uwais, and he has conducted several of these risk management and risk mitigation workshops in partnership with me as well as independently, and he was also a part of the faculty at Seton Hall. So the question is fairly simple. Can you increase your risk management capability through automations? What are the options? Do they work? But I believe the answer is more complex. So the complexity comes from the fact that the risk management ecosystem has, in my judgment, two elements to it: a regular program and an unplanned part of the program. The regular part of the program is your regular operations, your risks that you have already identified, spectrum of SOPs to manage those risks, and capacities that you have structured and enabled to handle that program. Where the challenge comes in is how do you structure a program for expansion, for variability, and here are just four of some of the major disruptions to your compliance risk management and your compliance operations that can come in. Many of you have experienced it. I've had an opportunity to talk to many of you who have shared some of these challenges. And let me point out four of those. And certainly the total exhaustive list is much longer, but I selected these four for illustration of that challenge where compliance management becomes a complex ecosystem when some of these disruptive factors come into play. What are those? Strategic restructuring, expanding to global footprint, leadership changes that sometimes bring a change to the tone at the top, and firefighting. I have absolutely no doubt that many, if not all of you, have experienced, if not some of these disruptive factors. I want to take each one of them at a time and share how and what type of disruption they might cause. And then we'll talk about the fact that automation can bring a level of stability and capacity. Automation in the perfect regular world of compliance management may be too simplistic, but the reality is much more complex. That's where the automation comes into play, where it gives you automation for managing your SOPs. It gives you the capacity to manage your regularly structured program, while it gives you the flexibility and freedom to go and handle the ad hoc challenges that come in, knowing that your regular program is on a schedule, is managed by a mechanism that is constantly at play. So let's start looking at some of these disruptive forces. Strategic restructuring. That could be an acquisition by you or an acquisition by another manufacturer. It could be a merger. It could be launching of a new product. It could be acquisition of a set of products. It could be an unexpected increase in risk due to changes in accepted dosage, due to changes in your product function features or changes to your sales force. And then certainly, as I just called out, M&A culture issues. So beyond the structural changes, handling the culture of the new partner, handling the culture of any new team members that come in as a result of strategic restructuring. And it could simply be changing to the structure of your organization, marketing and sales getting integrated, they getting separated, adding a new geographic location, and so forth. So that said, what does this do? A new product certainly demands adding new SOPs, adding new experiences, what that product and that therapeutic class and area brings in, certainly new SOPs and workflows. Increased risk, initial reaction often what I've seen is increased workarounds and shortcuts for handling some of those new risks till you get a handle on it and they become part of your regular program. You could also introduce some sort of information and filing errors. And then lastly, the biggest, cultural friction with M&A culture issues, and certainly difference in SOPs across organizations. Is this something to be expected? Well, if you look at the recent history, there were $331 billion worth of M&A deals in 2018, and another 400 billion is expected in 2019. In fact, let me correct myself. So the total amount in 2018 was 308. 331 to 400 billion is expected in 2019. In either case, it's a very large amount, which represents many organizations that might face it. This is not limited to those larger pharma manufacturers who might be acquirers. It certainly affects a lot of small to mid-sized pharma who might have unique offerings, unique therapies, and are very attractive as part of a product profile, and they are affected by some of these changes. What are some of the other disruptive factors? Expanding global footprint. And there are two aspects to it. Today, increasingly, pharma is operating as a global entity. As you grow your footprint, I've had an opportunity to be part of a couple of legal teams in the past, and in that capacity, we knew that the intellectual property rights follow a certain pattern. Right? Typically, many manufacturers start with US because that might give you the most expansive intellectual property rights, then you might go to EU and then to several consortiums of member countries. So again, as a product expands or through partnership as geographies expand, in either case, you now have many of your teams now have to look at compliance risk globally. And that opens up a whole new spectrum that again is not often part of your regular program. What does this mean? This means a lot of negotiation and renegotiation with teams who might have a whole different set of cultural and compliance practices. You're certainly also exposed to prevalent industry practices in host countries. We can have a whole series of sessions on what those host country practices might impose on your compliance policies and SOPs. So that's a whole science and art to itself. And then from a local entity standpoint, you need to work with their GRC framework so that you can incorporate your global regulatory SOPs with their local framework in order to make it work for their local entity, but also to comply with your global framework. That said, there are many other challenges where the cultural changes come into play. Difference in kickbacks and practices around it. What does it constitute? Certainly, risk of whistleblowers, fraud and false claims acts, and so forth. So all these factors introduce a whole new element of disruption to your compliance risk management program that might be nicely, cohesively structured for your existing scope. But if it is not prepared for capacity changes, ad hoc changes, and unexpected disruption, that program would be in for a tailspin unless it is supported by some mechanism of running it in a automated structured fashion while you tackle expanding global footprint changes. What are some of the other disruptions? And I'll actually point out to a case, and this points as much to the cultural difference as it points to the complexity with the global setup, where an American subsidiary of an Indian pharmaceutical company became a compliance case in point when it pleaded guilty to a False Claims Act case in 2013. That resulted in a criminal fine of approximately $150 million, along with settled civil claims suits under the False Claims Act related to state laws for another $350 million. So, and this expansion towards East and Far East Asia continues. What this all means is that you have to have the ability and capacity to let your regular program continue while you pay attention to some of these ad hoc demands of global expansion that come into play. Another change that we talked about, which often is pointed out as a significant factor in compliance and risk management, is tone at the top. Now, of course, tone at the top is a function of the leadership team. What if there is a change at that level? That change introduces a potential change in risk appetite, a potential change on stance on control measures, and also each leadership team brings with it its own past disciplinary record around compliance and regulation. So this again necessitates a lot of focus and direction towards this disruption. It can be slow or fast, renegotiation, and if the frequency of these changes in the leadership structure are frequent, that then becomes a program to manage in itself. Again, this speaks volumes for setting up a program that's prepared for capacity changes so that at least your regular program stays well in control, well in compliance, SOPs and regulations that you've put in place while you put energies towards such changes around the tone at the top. I want to call out that there's a white paper that one of my colleagues had recently published around operational risk measurement tools, controls, and measures that can provide a source of stability and continuity in managing such changes. And anyone who's interested will be happy to share that white paper with you after the webinar. So that's the third element to potential disruption in your compliance management program. The fourth one we talked about is firefighting. If you haven't experienced those three, and I'm sure many of you have, you certainly may have experienced firefighting of various types that goes on. This is just a very short illustrative list. Any type of fine, whether that's off-label promotion, whether that's any type of, even from a sample distribution standpoint, any issues that come up with missing samples, any issue that comes up with any aspect of your regulatory management, something as simple as reporting any adverse events in a timely manner, that can result in FDA penalty. As these things happen, you probably have experienced that that introduces an emergency reaction from the leadership. When that happens, you are again asked to go and take a look at your operational risk measurement and management tools. And that's where a program that's already in place that provides you risk measurement, that provides you a level of stability and continuity, will give you the ad hoc capacity to redirect your attention towards the challenge that comes in. I stopped short of talking about corporate integrity agreements. As you know, that is taking a stable pond and then taking a big stick and shaking the whole compliance capability that you have in place, and that certainly puts a compliance program in a tailspin, and similar other compliance issues. So I talked about several disruptive forces, strategic restructuring, expanding global footprint, leadership changes, and firefighting, right? But all these come back to one basic premise that I laid out at the beginning. And that premise was that compliance teams are constantly battling the challenge of balancing risk management against capacity. Are there mechanisms in place, which I believe they are, to allow leaner compliance teams to gain capacity through a level of risk mitigation and risk management through automation? And next, I'm going to talk about how some of those capabilities might help you diffuse the high cost or complexity of broader scaling of your compliance management capability. So I will talk to you now a bit more about establishing stability through automation. How do we apply our knowledge of some of the existing capabilities that many of you might have experienced, such as heat maps around risk prioritization and key risk indicators. For the benefit of those who might be joining today's webinar from other functional teams, such as sales and marketing, or operations, or finance, I will try to provide brief descriptions and definitions of some of the labels that I'm going to use for my next part of the conversation in this webinar in terms of automation. But let me first lay the groundwork on what I mean by increasing capacity through a level of automation, purely from a risk management standpoint. What you see outside of the circle is the traditional compliance SOPs, compliance management at play. And this does not demand automation, but it certainly demands a certain level of discipline in your compliance management approach. Heat maps refer to your prioritization of risk, where you are seeking right information to manage and prioritize those risks and stay within on the right side of that risk management. And benchmarking in its simplest form would be looking at your compliance challenges, issues, audits, and your ability to stay ahead of those issues and audits in historical terms. Where I want to now introduce a level of automation is taking that traditional model of compliance management tools, heat maps and benchmarking, and then applying a level of automation where you now have live information coming in terms of business activity, and you set up a set of key risk indicators that help tie in the risks associated with heat maps and benchmark those risks against history. And then you take those key risk indicators and match them up with triggers that give you alerts when those risks are triggered. Those automated alerts take away your demand on your time to constantly monitor, and you now offset that constant monitoring to these triggers. They certainly, hopefully, give you increased capacity from that constant monitoring. And secondly, they give you a broader capacity where, from a manual standpoint, you might be able to monitor a certain percentage. Let's use an example, time expense reports. You may be able to monitor 10% of expense reports at best, but with automated triggers and key risk indicators, that capacity now goes to 100%. And then you'll be only monitoring those where there are violations versus just searching for violations. Again, benchmarks come into play along with automation to give you now data sets to compare how many violations you had year over year and how is that trend working for you. And what that also does is it gives you the ability to go back and restructure and readjust your risk heat maps, readjust your benchmarks, and reestablish your risk criteria. So that said, let me take you to the next aspect to it, which is integrating your automation into your risk management as a program. In simple terms, what that means is that the automation gives you feedback, and that should help you set your SOPs, your benchmarks, and you readjust your priorities from risk. That integrated ecosystem is where there are organizations today who start to benefit in management of their risk through automation. A couple more topics related to it. I won't dive into the heat maps, but my colleague Tala had offered to the participants at the beginning of the webinar that if any one of you are interested, he has offered to walk you through the process of identifying key risk indicators and automating those key risk indicators through a workshop. So you may want to consider taking advantage of it. And as part of that workshop, the details of this heat map and similar heat maps are defined, identified, and detailed. But for the webinar participants, it suffices to say that this heat map assessment is nothing else but doing a math between impact of risk or consequences, between minor, moderate, and major, and the probability of risk from highly likely to less likely. And by applying those two products, you get your heat map of those areas that are higher risk for your organization. This, of course, is different and unique for each organization, so that demands a level of assessment independently for each organization. And then taking it to automation, and my colleague Mohammed Uwais will talk about taking this risk assessment matrix to its final point of automation towards later half of this webinar. So two options for you. You can reach out to Tala Awan for a workshop in walking you through what this entails and helping you maybe even produce this heat map for your organization, or participate in the later half of this webinar when Mohammed Uwais walks you through the techniques for conducting it if you want to do it on your own. Quick definitions, a key risk indicator. What is it? In the context of this webinar, as well as in the context of many of the discussions I've had with the compliance teams, a key risk indicator is a quantitative metric that's based on a certain time period that measures business performance against focused incident thresholds for each business line. I'll walk you through a few examples, but a key risk indicator helps you define acceptable boundaries for each form of activity and for each compliance category. An example is speaker event. An example of a key risk indicator at a speaker event would be number of attendees. And you might have a policy to have a minimum number of attendees at a speaker event. We have all heard about incidents where regulators question and challenge a speaker event where there are no attendees, a speaker event where there are no HCPs, or a speaker event where only attendees from the speaker's institution or colleagues participate. So this is a risk, and a way to manage that risk is to set up a key risk indicator and then let that key risk indicator in an automated fashion check for that risk, and you only respond to or react to the trigger when those risk events happen. Another example, staying with the speaker event for a key risk indicator, would be the maximum allowed meal amount at a speaker event. And I'll speak to these two a little later as well. So what's a trigger? A trigger is any value that offsets notifications within your risk automation system. So a trigger works hand in hand with a key risk indicator. So a key risk indicator helps you define the limit. A trigger will be the value that alerts you when that limit has been met. A trigger may be exactly at the same level or limit as your key risk indicator, or it may be slightly higher or lower. Let's understand this through an example. Let's say that a key risk indicator, which I talked about earlier, you're trying to manage is minimum number of attendees at a speaker event. And let's say your SOP says that you should have at least 4 attendees at a external hosted speaker event. Now, given that key risk criteria that your compliance SOP states, you can then have a trigger that's now looking for events that has less than 3 attendees, right? So in this situation, you are setting up a trigger that's a bit more stringent than your KRI. Your KRI says less than a minimum 4 attendees must be there. Your trigger is saying, you know what, even if you have 3, it's okay, but once it starts to go below 3, someone needs to go and take a look at it. Conversely, you can set this trigger at 5 or 6 so as to be a bit more conservative, right? So triggers help you with 2 things: your capacity to react to your KRI, as well as your risk mitigation process, and then lastly, the level of conservativeness or challenge that you want to take on by setting up these triggers. And same applies to, let's say, a meal amount. Let's say your policy states that the maximum transferable value for a meal amount at a speaker event is 250, and you might set a trigger exactly at that, 250. So the trigger would then look for any time that max amount is exceeded and will inform you. And then you have the option to address and mitigate, and I'll talk about that briefly, what happens next, right? So in the context of a pharma compliance management, what are some of these automation mechanisms mean? Let's look at a scenario. Let's look at HCP spend. Now, I'm choosing a very basic one. Certainly, monitoring and compliance is much more comprehensive. Many of you are dealing with distributors, international shipments. You might be dealing with the sampling policies and HCP interactions and so forth. But taking this simple scenario, a transfer of value and exceeding a certain violation threshold, the one we set, 250 for a speaker event, is your SOP. Then as you set up the automation, you want to know that by how much of that policy is exceeded would you want to be alerted. What are some of the patterns of violations you want to be alerted? This is where benchmarking comes in. What if those violations have happened too frequently? Also seasonal aspects to it. And those seasonal aspects might be a lot of lunch and learns happening, a lot of speaker events happening, launch of a new product, etc. So all those factors go into setting up your automation mechanisms, and in KRIs, key risk indicators, triggers, and dashboards give you several dials to either be more aggressive or conservative in managing your risks. I think I've covered several examples of triggers, so I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time, and then take you to the culmination of setting up this automation capability. It comes back and gives you a dashboard. And in this case, using a very simple stoplight uh, presentation mode, a green represents those events that are within your compliance thresholds. Red are events that are outside of those. And then these dashboards allow you to go and look at all those violations and then make a decision how to mitigate it. And once you make a decision to mitigate, the full cycle would be to either adjust your SOPs or adjust your triggers or key risk indicators in order to improve the benchmarking of your compliance management. Um, I will call out that Core Data has had offered its partners as well as many of the folks in the industry an opportunity to understand how these dashboards work in cohesion with triggers, key risk indicators, compliance management. And you can reach out to my colleague Tala Wan to get a demonstration. I know that there are over 50 different monitoring and analytics dashboards in the library of Core Data's analytical assets. And based on the topic of interest, you can get a more focused and custom discussion and demonstration around those, so you have better sort of appreciation for examples related to these key risk indicators. I'm going to dive into another aspect of risk management and go into a more focused element around it, which is secondary or second level analysis. And what does that mean? Essentially, second level analysis gives you an opportunity to look at the incident from a different threshold. Let's assume that your meal spend threshold is $50. Anything above that is a violation. And let's say you get two different triggers back to you. One is a rep who's spending over $1,300 in a week across a couple of HCPs, week over week, but is not exceeding the $50 threshold. Second is a rep that's spending $60 on a single meal multiple times on, let's say, a dozen HCPs. So these are two very different aspects of policy violations. The first one is actually technically not a policy violation, but when you start aggregating this information, and automation allows you to do so, that's when you begin to look at the secondary level analysis for risk automation. And now you might start setting up triggers at aggregated amounts and not just simple single policy factors. Another thing that comes in is pattern detection. I'm going to use the example in this case. For example, 15 calls per week, several with lunch and learn spend at a single HCP, frequent small violations of limits. So these are all secondary level analysis that becomes available and contributes to the overall ecosystem of risk management where automation starts contributing. Let me wrap up my portion of today's webinar with talking about compliance risk control measures, right? So what are some of those risk control measures? Three aspects to it: mitigating the risk through benchmarking and automation. Based on the feedback that's coming from the loop on the right side, and I'll touch on it, you then have an opportunity to redesign process to reduce risk, and that then contributes to setting up new SOPs. And this is automation in action. So let me then just touch on the last part of the automation ecosystem that contributes to the risk control measures ecosystem. You set the limits. Based on those, you design the automation process. Your history comes in to contribute to it. Based on the result sets that you see, established through KRIs and triggers, you might set revised ceilings. As you set the revised ceilings, you go back and compare the benchmark history, and that again helps you look at the limits, and that is the constant measurement and management ecosystem that's at play. That then goes in and contributes to your risk control measures. If you have this type of capability operating, I'll go back and call out some of the disruptive factors I mentioned earlier, things like strategic restructuring, expanding global footprint, leadership changes, firefighting. When those things come into play and they demand your attention away from your day-to-day risk control measures, this automated ecosystem contributing to your risk management continues to operate. It gives you the necessary stability. It gives you the capacity expansion. And imagine that new product comes in that now demands adding all these elements to support compliance of that product. Setting up that product becomes much more structured, simpler, and faster versus managing that product in an ad hoc manner and then only going to a structured program. That concludes my portion of today's webinar. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm going to transition back to my colleague Talawan to continue with the remaining part of the agenda.
Thank you, Ned. Thank you so much. So it's time to welcome our expert on call, Mohammed Awais. Hi, Mohammed, welcome. And we can start off with your part of the presentation.
Thank you, Tala. Are you going to be walking through the slides, or should I present my screen?
So while Mohammed is getting ready, I had a few questions that had come up for Ned. Maybe we can dive into answering those and then see if Mohammed's on the line as well. So Ned, one of the questions that came up was if you could give an example of the qualitative insight from which you form a revised benchmark on triggers. So if you could give that example.
Okay. So this is a complex question, right? Because qualitative insights getting converted to quantitative does require a level of assessment and analysis. But what I would say is that let's use an example that the data collected, let's say during ride-alongs, where you can collect non-qualitative observations about each visit and interaction might be an example where qualitative insights are getting captured. Of course, you will have to start categorizing that qualitative insight, and then that will start to disclose its own impressions of such visits, and it could be about response to drug queries. It could be about ensuring that all the exclusions and label warnings are communicated. It could even be about literature being fully explained and defined. So those are some of the, that might be an example of a qualitative insight that marries up with quantitative measures.
All right. Mohammed.
Are you able to hear me? Tala, I'm not sure if you're able to hear. This is Mohammed here.
So my colleague Mohammed Awais has joined, and I think we will be transitioning over to him momentarily.
There seems to be an audio issue. And
is this
Mohammed is joining us from a remote site, and what is a webinar without some disruption of audio-visual components? And of course, as I had mentioned to you, he and I have partnered up on several key risk indicator workshops. So what I'll do is I'll start to tee up some of that information uh, till he joins, or is he good? Mohammed, can you hear us?
I can hear you perfectly fine, and I am in the webinar. I'm not sure if there's a way you can hear me, Ned.
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome
Okay,
to the.
perfect. Yeah, minor hiccup is what we need to make this interesting, right?
All right.
So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ned and Tala, for inviting me to join the webinar. I was listening in throughout the session, and there was a few interesting aspects around risk indicators and the metrics that we generally start out with. So just by way of quick introduction, my name is Mohammed Owais. I'm CEO and founder of Core Data. Prior to Core Data, I spent good 12 years in the space working on data and analytics, and over the last 3 years have been busy working on the compliance data analytics product called Compliance Insights at Core Data. So very excited to join you guys, and what I will do is in the next 5 or so minutes, just quickly describe to you how we get started with creating risk indicators. In working with customers over the last 3 years, what we realized is that the outcome of a dashboard is not really the end goal. And when we first created dashboards, they had pretty pictures, showed the information in the way that it needs to be shown, was visually appropriate. We realized that our customers didn't end up using it. And the challenge isn't so much with the design of the dashboard as it is with connecting that dashboard to your compliance risk or the organization's priority. So what we follow now is a methodology that works really well. So we start with what are the risks that you see in your compliance programs or the organization overall. Once you have a list of those risks created or at least highlighted, then we go into prioritizing those risks into what you would like to tackle first. And the mechanism we use is shown on the screen, which is a very straightforward risk assessment metrics. On the vertical axis, y-axis, is the impact of risk, also known as consequence, and we go through an exercise and have you rate each one of those risks that you have highlighted into a category called minor, moderate, or major. Second, then we go into what we call the probability of risk, which is on the horizontal or x-axis, the probability of likelihood or likelihood of risk. And we ask you to rate in the same categories, unlikely, moderately likely, or highly likely. And then we create a combination of this metric using very simple math. So you're able to see your risks, the highest and the extreme risks being visible on the top right corner and marked as extreme, while the risks that you mark as having minor impact or unlikely to happen are rated as low and green. Then you get a choice for where you want to start. You can, of course, start with the extreme risks. That's usually a good place to start, but some customers do start with what might be high risk on this metric. So Tala, if you can go to the next slide, please. And the idea that this risk prioritization exercise connects your organization's risk priorities to a meaningful output where everyone can align. So we've had this exercise done with 2 people in the room to all the way almost 8 people joining in with remote teams in there as well. And the output then allows all of those 2 to 6 or 8 people to get on that same page on what are we tackling in the compliance and what are we going to provide and put resources towards. So once that's established, so for example, let's say you pick, so what I walked you through were actually steps 1 and 2. So for example, if you see on this screen, the first step was identifying risk areas, and then the second step was risk prioritization. So this is the rating of those areas in columns B and C. And in this case, we can quickly see that this particular customer rated HCP meals as the highest, as the area where they consider to be the highest risk. Once that happens, what we do is we start with that category, and then we create what we call key risk indicators. And this is a combination of a whiteboard exercise. So for example, in this case of HCP meals, we would ask questions such as, okay, what constitutes a risk in your HCP meals program, right? And the participants in that workshop may respond with, exceeding our meal limits as one area. Another areas could be the number of violations occurring within a certain span of time, let's say a month or a quarter. Another violation could be delayed report submission. Another violation could be frequency of meals to a given HCP, right? So they go through what they consider as risks. And then we also, as part of our toolbox, have identified a variety of risks within that area, and we ask questions around whether those risks are also risks to their organization. The end result is what is shown in workshop step 3, where we take that particular category and then agree on the top 3 or top 5 or top 7 key risk indicators, depending on how big the program is and how big that area is. Once that happens, that is 60 to 70% of the work that done in a single workshop. Then we go back to access the data that would allow us to monitor that risk using the indicator selected. At that point, then we go into what constitutes getting the data and then creating a dashboard. So Tala, if you can move to that next slide, please. Once you have the dashboard now, the idea is you've connected that dashboard all the way to your risk priorities. So this dashboard becomes much more meaningful in addition to having really applicable and really nicely done visuals. You also can quickly connect it to an organizational priority. So this becomes much more usable, much more frequented, much more valuable as a result. And this is just giving you an example of a speaker program dashboard that we would work with to create with you in this particular workshop. And then the output of this is then built. We go and fetch the data, and then you're able to utilize the dashboard using the KRIs that you have built. So this is essentially a process that takes your risk areas, prioritizes it, picks one of those areas, creates a few risk indicators, creates a dashboard output, and then gets the data fetched to be able to monitor it over time. So you can now imagine if a dashboard that you have in front of you as a compliance risk indicator dashboard, you're able to see this on a weekly or a monthly basis. The data is refreshed. You can quickly identify the HCPs, the reps you want to either target or dig further into. And the platform itself allows you to start from that high level risk and then go into and dig in by selecting any of those areas to those individual transactions. So I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot, and I'll if we can maybe transition back to Ned. So this is the part of the workshop I wanted to cover. If there's questions, I'll definitely stay till the end of the webinar and happy to take any questions.
Right. Thank you, Mohammed. So there is a question for you, if you could answer. The question is, can compliance monitoring help you if you have subsidiaries outside of the US? So is it applicable for the EU region as well from American manufacturers?
That's a great question, Tala. So I think compliance monitoring has to be an integral part of any compliance team. and it has to be driven by risk. So some organizations, the risks are actually greater outside the US than they are in the US, right? So if you are developing either a monitoring program, whether it's driven by analytic monitoring, which we are talking about today, and risk-based analytic monitoring more specifically, if your risks are bigger ex-US, whether it's FCPA or any other type of regulation that you are concerned about, of course, your monitoring program has to address that. So, Kala, yes, the geography is not a constraint when it comes to implementing a monitoring program. What is a constraint is the resources that you can put to bear and the expertise that you can pull in, and if you can do and where you would like to start. So those are some initial areas to consider, but definitely go where the highest risks are.
All right, thank you, Mohammed. So I see we still have 4 minutes remaining, and just chime in with your questions, attendees. We would be happy to answer those questions at hand. And like I said, I wanted to as I said in the beginning, we're offering a free KRI workshop to all attendees. You can register at codata.com/KRI. That's the landing page that you could go to register this free KRI workshop, or just share your contact details in the chat box. One of our colleagues would get in touch with you and schedule the session. We would be, of course, we're always happy to come to your offices, bring delicious food, and conduct this workshop free of cost to you. We're waiting in on the questions. All right, I guess we can end this this webinar early. Give 3 minutes back to your time. So thank you everyone for dialing in today, and I especially thank Ned and Mohammed, my speakers, to go over this content for us. I hope all the attendees would find this useful and relevant in their line of work. Again, we're always happy to do this workshop for you. Just register at codata.com/KRI, and one of our colleagues will get in touch with you. All right. If you have any questions, reach out to us anytime. Have a great day and goodbye.